Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the atrocities that were committed in the Second World War. These were crimes against humanity that were committed against civilians, prisoners of war, and are just an aspect that make this Second World War so devastating. The treatment of people beyond the battlefield was something that had never been seen in history before. So the atrocity we remember the most in World War II was the German genocide, or as it's referred to, the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a systematic execution of racial, religious, political, or cultural groups that the Germans deemed enemies of the state. Germans executed about 12 million people in the Holocaust, 6 million of which were of the Jewish faith. And the execution of the Jews was known as the final solution. That is, the final solution to the Jewish problem was exterminating them. So as the war began to turn, the Nazis, with their racist philosophy, began to try to rid the German state of what they saw as enemies of the state. These were racial enemies. These were other ethnicities, other nationalities that they did not want. But they were also undesirables. So Jews, Slavs, Poles, Gypsies, and undesirables were executed. Undesirables were homosexuals, mentally ill people, and political dissidents. Those who disagreed with the Nazi philosophy were put to death. So that is, the Germans were trying to kill and execute people that they did not want in their state. Why did they do this? They found these people an easy scapegoat. The Nazis blamed the Jews in particular for the loss in World War I and for the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler wanted to exact revenge on the Jews. They also believed that they were a superior race and that these other people were going to denigrate their master race, and they wanted people who were inclined to conform and obey. So people that would disagree with them were seen as enemies. Here you can see Nazi propaganda from the Second World War. So there you see the depiction of a Jewish man on the left hiding behind the British, American, and Soviet flags. Then on the right you see another racist depiction of a Jewish person with the words "Caution Jew," basically pointing out that these are enemies, that they are others, that they are not part of Germany. So even before the war started in 1935, the Germans began to persecute Jews. One of the first measures was what are known as the Nuremberg laws. These stripped Jews of their citizenship rights, they segregated Jews from Germans, and they forced Jews to wear armbands signifying that they were Jews. And these armbands look like that star there. You see the word Jew and the Star of David on them. So that was to signify that these people were different, that they were not citizens, they were not part of the state. This persecution turned violent in 1938 and during what is known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht in German. Germans and Austrians attacked Jews, destroyed their businesses, and burned down synagogues. The people that did this faced no penalty or punishment. So they were able to openly attack Jews, burn down their businesses, attack them. And the reason it's known as the Night of Broken Glass is because the streets were littered with broken glass from these Jewish shops. Nazis were taught to hate others at a young age. The Hitler Youth embraced anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. Here you can see members, young members, teenage members of the Hitler Youth watching adult Jews clean the streets by hand. You can see children watching them, and they're marching around, commanding these adults. So you can see kind of the creation of this hatred at a young age. As war broke out, German soldiers often turned to mass executions of these enemies that they saw, particularly Jews. Often they would shoot them in mass graves or execute them in public to make a statement. Jews were rounded up in cities. They were forced to move into what were known as ghettos. These ghettos were Jewish neighborhoods where they lived in very poor conditions, and Germans rounded them up, taking their property, forcing them out of their homes, often with as little as what they could carry on their backs. So you see this here, German troops kicking Jews out of their dwellings and taking them to the ghettos. In this picture, you can see the dehumanization that the Germans felt for the Jews and for the undesirables. Here you see a German soldier kicking Jews as they get into a truck to be deported, and you see the German to the left in the helmet smiling. It's all a game to them. Jews were soon deported from the ghettos to concentration camps. The idea of the concentration camps was that those that could work would basically be worked to death. Those who could not work would be put to death. Treatment at the concentration camps was horrific. These people were malnourished and mistreated to extreme ends, often living on no food or just enough food to survive and work. Here you can see the conditions of men who are starving to death in these concentration camps. Sunken bones, ribs showing, just the horrible treatment, living on top of each other. The horrible mistreatment went even farther than that. German doctors conducted experiments on human subjects, often being horrific in nature. What you see here is a horrible image of a man whose skin has been burned. What happened is a doctor mixed together a mixture of phosphorus, which is highly flammable, and rubber, which of course is sticky, put it on a man's skin and lit it on fire for 20 seconds to see what would happen. So they're using people as live experiments. And it's just the treatment, and it's even hard to imagine how people could treat other people like this. Maybe the most horrific aspect of all of this in the concentration camps is the invention of industrialized murder. That is, using the mechanisms of industrial nations to murder people. So what the Nazis do in the concentration camps, for those who can't work, either too young, too old, unable, women, children, sick men, put them to death in gas chambers. So rather than use bullets on them, they would march them into chambers, gas them, and then they would use ovens to cremate the bodies, mass graves. And it's truly horrific to see how far this has gone, to see the treatment of humans, to see a system of industrialized murder. Here you can see the remnants of this. You can see a pile of human bones after being in an oven, and this is the results of one day of executions at Buchenwald concentration camp. 100,000 people were murdered and found dead when the Allies liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. You can see there, it's a horrible picture, but it lets it sink in just how terrible this was. So even when inmates were on the verge of liberation, guards made sure that they put them to death. That happened at Gardenlegen. Allies were on the verge of liberating this camp. 1,100 inmates were forced into a barn and guards set it on fire. Only 12 inmates survived the fire. So the Germans were willing to go to extremes to kill Jews and other undesirables. Here's a tray of wedding bands that Allied soldiers found when they liberated a concentration camp. Jewelry and other things were often taken off Jews or other people before they were put to death. And this just gives you an idea of the number of people that were killed. Germans also reacted harshly to civilians outside of the concentration camps. So in Ludice, Czechoslovakia, the town was accused of harboring a fugitive who had killed a German officer. German soldiers burned the town to the ground. They executed all the men, and the women and children were sent to camps. They then bulldozed the rest of the town to the ground. So the treatment of civilians in this war by the Germans is horrible. Here's a depiction of the mass grave after the men of the town had been executed by firing. So the Germans would just go by and kill one by one. But it wasn't just the German army that treated civilians and others horribly in World War II. The Russian army, as it began to push back into German territory, push back from the Soviet Union through Eastern Europe into Germany, did some horrible things to civilians in retaliation for the Germans invading Russia. Here are a couple of quotes about what the Russian army was willing to do to civilians, to people they found as they began to invade Germany. Men and women were stripped naked and forced to perform sadistic acts on one another or eat excrement. Girls had to press burning banknotes between their legs. The Red Army killed 72 women and 1 man. Most of the women had been raped, and whom the oldest was 184. Some of the victims have been crucified. So the Red Army, in retaliation, is unleashing horrific acts as it is invading Germany, as it is occupying Germany. Again, in kind of saying that you invaded us, we are going to destroy you. It's not just enough to beat you. We are going to destroy your men and women. And it is just really, there's no other word but horrific. Japanese soldiers were also infamous for their treatment of prisoners of war. One of the most horrific acts was what's known as the Bataan Death March. This happened after the defeat of the Philippines. American soldiers, along with Filipino soldiers, were forced on a 60-mile march, but were not given any water, food, any assistance along the way. And the Japanese brutally beat them when they fell down, shot them on the way if they could not go any farther. 5,000 U.S. soldiers died along the way. Someone described it as they were sulking along 100 yards behind our contingent, came up a cleanup squad of murdering Jap buzzards. Their helpless victims sprawled darkly against the white of the road were easy targets. So the Japanese soldiers would just go down and shoot people at random. The Japanese code was no surrender. They believed that surrendering was cowardly. Japan encouraged its soldiers and civilians to commit suicide rather than to be taken prisoner. So over 1,000 residents of Saipan were marched off a cliff by Japanese soldiers. This shows how extreme they were willing to go. The town was captured. They were getting ready to get taken over by the United States. And so rather than surrender, Japanese soldiers forced people to commit suicide, forced them to die, and then the soldiers fought to death or committed suicide themselves. So they considered it cowardly, so they treated prisoners of war horribly. Following the Second World War, the United Nations held what was known as the Nuremberg War Trials. These were trials of Nazi leaders who had committed war crimes. In these trials, it found that 200 Nazis were found guilty of war crimes. These were leaders, people held personally responsible for their actions. They were said to have individual responsibility. And the Nuremberg war trials also fueled the demand for a Jewish homeland. The idea is that if this could happen to Jews in Europe, that they needed a place where they had a sanctuary, where they could get away from everybody. And this is what would lead to the creation of the modern state of Israel. Here's a picture of Hermann Goering. Goering was the leader of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and he was also one of the highest commanders of the Nazi regime. He was also seen as a right-hand man to Hitler. He was captured in Berlin following the war and was tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and was sentenced to death. However, while he waited being put to death, someone gave him a cyanide tablet in his cell, which he ate and committed suicide. So Goering was not put to death, but he was convicted of crimes. And he represents some of the Germans that were convicted of crimes. So 200 Germans were convicted of crimes at Nuremberg. This is also at Nuremberg when you see the famous German defense of, "I was only following orders." They tried to claim that the defense was, "I was just following the orders that were given to me. I might have killed thousands of people, but they were just orders." But the United Nations does not fall for this defense and does convict 200 of them, putting several to death. So after the war, nations agreed on the Geneva Peace Convention. That is, they had learned the lessons, seen the lessons of the Second World War, and did not want to see a repeat of what had happened in that war with the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. So what this agreed on was humane treatment of prisoners. It standardized rules for all nations, and it was largely a reaction to the Japanese mistreatment of POWs. But it also laid out rules for civilian treatment, for not targeting civilian sinners, and stuff like this, because of the lessons that we saw in the atrocities of the Second World War.